Salt marshes. First of all, we need to think about what they are. They are areas of periodically flooded, low-lying coastal wetlands. And they are often rich in biodiversity, especially halophytes, so salt-tolerant plant species, and birds. They form a great habitat for birds, especially those that like to nest on the ground. So what you can see on the left is I've got the low tide mark down at the bottom, then the average high tide in the middle, and the spring high tide up at the very top. And this shows that process that periodically floods our salt marshes, causing them to be one of these very saline environments, at least to begin with. Well, what actually happens? So let's start at number 1, which you can see. This is our little coastal inlet. Possibly it's behind a bar. So salt marshes begin as an accumulation of sediment. They find a sheltered bit of coastline where it's very low energy and lots of deposition can occur, usually behind a spit or a bar, and our fine sediment particles group together in a process that we call flocculation. And as this happens, more deposition occurs. It builds up the mud and it breaks the surface to form a mudflat. So mudflats are the first stage of our salt marsh succession. Let's just add those notes in here. So sediment accumulates, sticks together, and builds up to form mudflats. The next thing that happens as we move landward is we start to get into the area that is called the low marsh. So let's just quickly move those notes for number 1. Oop, there we go. I just pop them down here. And then we can start looking at number 2. So what happens in our low marsh is we start to get pioneer species. So these pioneer plants colonize the area. That means that they start to establish themselves in this salt marsh, this early salt marsh. And these pioneer plants are usually things like cord grass, for example. Grass, there we go. So this salt-tolerant species tends to trap sediment using its long roots, which also prevent it from being washed away. And as it traps sediment, it builds up even more deposition, and it actually stabilizes the area. So long roots, trap sediment, encourage deposition, and stabilize the mudflat. And this is where we start seeing the early parts of our salt marsh happening. And then as we move into area 3, we start to see our colonization even further. But before we go there, we should probably just go back and add a few little bits of these cordgrass, these pioneer species, just in at number 2, showing that we've got this colonization. And as we start to move into 3, we start to see even more plants taking hold. And this is where we get things like sea aster and sea lavender forming. They're a little bit less salt tolerant than our cordgrass, a little bit more established. Okay, and this is in what we call the high marsh. I'm just going to add that note down here. It's called the high marsh, obviously, because it's only affected at the very spring high tides with flooding. So as we move to 3, our conditions are far less harsh. Okay, the mud level rises. And as it rises, the rain tends to wash out some of the salt water, leaving it as far less saline. And this means that we can get more plants, bigger plants, better plants. And this also encourages our decomposition. So the decomposition means that we get an increasing amount of composition. There we go. Decomposition of plants means we get an increasing amount of soil fertility, which lead even more new plants to develop. So increases soil fertility. And eventually, over time, we get to stage 4. Now, stage 4 is the different one. Okay, it's where we go from being our general salt marsh back to being just our oak and shrub uplands. So this area is called the uplands, and it is characterised by oak trees and shrubs. So how do we get there from a mudflat then? Well, we've been through this process of our pioneer plants colonising the area. And then over time, this mud level rises and we see the rain washing out that salinity from our soil. And our decomposition increases that fertility. So over a time of about 100 or so years, we get this succession to an oak woodland. So oak trees and shrubs. Takes hundreds of years. And that is really all there is to it. We can add a little oak tree just in here. Let's get that going. And you can see we start building up these trees in this area and some little woody shrubs. And we end up with something that looks completely different to where we first started out. And that is how a salt marsh develops over time. Now, as we move backwards, let's keep this green on just over here so it's nice and visible. We've got this arrow going here, and then what we see here is our soil fertility improves as we move further landward. We see our salinity reducing. And the third thing we see as we move from the sea end to the landward edge, we see less sea water flooding, which again helps to decrease that salinity and encourage regular plants that aren't salt tolerant to develop there. Hopefully this helps.